Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Kathy Boffman McLeod. I am the CEO of Climate Resilience for All. And on behalf of Tailwind and Climate Works Foundation, welcome to our session on adaptation finance, a primer, the essentials, everything you need to know. There are so many resources and tools and taxonomies and some remarkable work, a lot of it done by Tailwind on how to think about financing adaptation, climate adaptation. And if you've joined today, you know that the need only grows and that every community, jurisdiction, company, organization will need to know how to put money and financing together to prepare for, withstand, and build back from uh, hotter, wetter, drier, more perilous climate fueled world. And this primer, while it includes a lot of the commercial side of climate adaptation, we have looked at this, the capital stack, the collection of sources of money quite broadly to acknowledge the role that certain types of financing, even household financing or loss and damage or disaster risk financing sources and how those fit in. And so we have a walkthrough for about 50 minutes, and we will then have time for Q&A, and we'll have a look at one case study. And when you think about how um, how these pieces come together, this body of work is meant for non-financial experts. And when you look at the list of those participating today, it is remarkable, from community organizations all the way to huge commercial banks and institutions and multilateral banks. So the interest is immense, and I want to say just on a couple of housekeeping. We are going to record today's session. Please use the Q&A function to put your questions in. And then lastly, a plug, Climate Resilience for All is dedicated to strengthening and supporting women's livelihoods and health in the face of extreme heat. And so you might say, well, why this project? And we know we won't be successful at achieving our mission if we don't find ways to pay for, finance, and invest in these solutions. And so I'd like to turn it over now to Jess Brown, who is a Senior Director for Adaptation and Resilience at Climate Works Foundation, who supported this work. So thank you from CRA and from Tailwind to you, Jess. And so over to you for a few comments, and then we'll get into the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all and be here this morning or afternoon, evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. As Kathy mentioned, my name is Jessica Brown. I lead the Adaptation and Resilience work and program at Climate Works Foundation. Climate Works is a global philanthropic organization. We have historically really been focused on the decarbonization side, on the mitigation side. And over the past year or two, my colleagues and I have been working to expand our world to also include and focus on the imperative of climate adaptation and resilience. We have been doing this in a couple of different ways. We now, in partnership with a number of other foundations, are leading a funder collaborative called ARC, the Adaptation Resilience Collaborative for Funders. This is really focused on helping to facilitate knowledge, coordination, and accelerate action among philanthropic organizations on the topic of adaptation globally. So we do a number of different convening events, learning sessions on different thematic topics, and also really try to accelerate action. Of course, adaptation finance is absolutely critical to all aspects of the adaptation resilience journey and agenda. So we felt really that was important to do as much as we can to get more knowledge and information out there to the community. That's in part why we supported this primer among CRA and Tailwind. As Kathy mentioned, it really is a matter of every community, every individual, every jurisdiction, and every investor either now needs or will need to be putting funding and investment into place to prepare for and manage risks associated with a changing climate. We wanted to support this primer because despite the fact that there is so much information out there on adaptation finance, we felt that there was really a lack of clarity of what is the role of different financial actors when it comes to different types of investments. How do financing needs and opportunities line up with the investment priorities and risks and appetite of different investors, all the way from an individual household to an institutional investor? So this primer starts to unpack some of that and get at some of that distillation. I just want to say a quick word on the role of philanthropy in helping to accelerate adaptation finance. We certainly can be viewed as an investor. I think primarily, however, we really view ourselves as helping to catalyze and unlock other investors' funding and financing for adaptation. So our role is really in knowledge sharing, information sharing, demystification, or demystifying. I don't know if demystification is a word. Demystifying some of the misperceptions and misconceptions related to investment and finance. We do a lot in terms of convening, knowledge sharing, knowledge building, piloting new projects, catalyzing new ideas, experimentation, risk taking, and all with the service of really helping to unlock investment at scale. So I'll close there and just say really happy to see such a large turnout today. I think we're all here because of the imperative of investing in adaptation and resilience. We are in a new climate reality. I know that most of us are already feeling the effects of climate. And we want to do everything we can to help support communities, especially those who are most deeply feeling the impacts. So with that, I will either pass it back to you, Kathy, or over to you, Emily. And thanks so much for having me here today.
Thank you, Jess. Yes, I will pass the mic to Emily Mazzacurati, co-founder of Tailwind, and a member of Climate Resilience for All's advisory board. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's morning here in California. And thank you again, Jess, for funding this project, and Kathy for the opportunity to collaborate. I'll introduce myself quickly, and then you'll hear a lot of me for the next 20-25 minutes as we get into the meat of the topic. So co-founder and managing partner of Tailwind, I have worked in the private sector on climate risk and adaptation for most of my career. Tailwind is an ecosystem builder and a venture firm. What that means is that we help educate the market about opportunities and needs related to private investment opportunities in adaptation and resilience. And so this fits into our effort to broaden the party, if I may, or at least broaden the group of stakeholders who think about adaptation and resilience. And we also have a venture fund with which we invest in early stage adaptation and resilience startups. So for today, what we're going to do is we're going to spend a few minutes covering basic concepts about adaptation and resilience. Then we're going to talk about adaptation finance at a high level. And then we're going to get into the more specific elements of different types of funders and sources of capital, their characteristics, and how they can be combined together. And again, this is really meant to be introductory level. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. And there is no dumb question. Put them in the Q&A. We'll tackle them towards the end of the presentation. If you're an expert, bear with us or go get a cup of coffee or jump in with additional comments and resources as well that you want to share with the community. What we're trying here is to, again, broaden the tent and bring in people from the private sector who may not be as familiar with the opportunities in adaptation, and of course, help folks on the community and nonprofit side also understand a little bit how the private sector thinks and, and how to tap some of those sources of capital. I will start with the unavoidable slide about the difference between adaptation and mitigation, just to confirm here that we are talking about adaptation, which is the process of adjusting to actual or expected climate change and its effects. And so we're looking both to minimize harm to people and community and economic losses, also looking to promote economic, social, and natural ecosystems co-benefits. What you see in the unavoidable Venn diagram that comes with the slide is the fact that there are a lot of activities that have co-benefits, both for adaptation and mitigation, ranging from ecosystem restoration, nature-based solutions, everything having to do with cooling, energy efficiency, water conservation, grid resilience, wildfire prevention. There's a broad range of activities that are really beneficial to both, and so it is always a good idea to tap both benefits and tap any source of capital for either. And then there's a range of activities that are just not related to mitigation. They're purely related to adaptation and dealing with the impacts of climate change. And those can have a harder time finding money for a range of reasons. When I talk about adaptation and resilience, it's any and all of those type of activities. And specifically, the definition is that we look at solutions. So that can be products and services. I have my private sector hat on here, or enabling interventions, programs, projects, policies that prepare for, prevent, respond to, or enable recovery from climate shocks and stressors. And that's important because we want to be clear here that anything upstream and downstream of climate impacts from our standpoint is very much related to adaptation and resilience. Adaptation is required across the entire economy. So going back to first principles, as human beings, we need food and shelter, we need water, we need infrastructure, we need ecosystems to function and social systems to operate. And so we built this taxonomy, and at the back of the slides, and the slides will be available as well, you'll see links to our other educational material, again, trying to broaden the tent and broaden the aperture of what does it mean to invest in adaptation. So when we say investing or funding adaptation, we're really looking at the entire spread of sectors and activities across human society and across ecosystems that will help not just the survival, but hopefully the thriving of humans and natural systems. One thing to keep in mind before we get more into the financial side of things is that adaptation is complex, it's nuanced, and it needs to be thought through really carefully because there is such a thing as maladaptation. And those are adaptation efforts that could lead to increased vulnerability to climate impacts. There's different flavors of maladaptation. One is some adaptation effort can lead to increase greenhouse gas emission. And that's not to say they shouldn't take place ever, but that's to say one needs to think about the trade-off between those things, and that just putting AC everywhere may not be the right solution. At the same time, AC can save lives, and we need to be again, to factor in immediate and long-term impacts. It could also be adaptation efforts that are just not adequate for future impacts and that lead to an inefficient use of resources. If you set up irrigation in an area that's just not going to be suitable for agriculture at all in 10 years, that may not be the best adaptation response. Or it could be adaptation efforts that have impact on others that are detrimental. And so the standard example is if you build a seawall that pushes water elsewhere, or flood prevention, flood mitigation measure that pushes water elsewhere and makes it worse for the communities, which has been known to happen, that would also not be good. So one needs to be really thoughtful in terms of potential direct and indirect impacts of adaptation activities. And that's something to keep in mind, and probably something we'll get to explore more in depth in future presentation. So let's go into adaptation finance. We define adaptation finance as the financial flows that support adaptation and resilience activities, including activities that seek to prevent harm, to reduce or transfer risk, to recover from impact, to compensate for loss and damage, and or to promote economic, social, and natural ecosystem co-benefits across all sectors. So again, a very broad definition. And you're going to hear me talk about the capital stack. And what I mean by that is the different sources of money that can come to help finance or fund different adaptation activities. So we built an illustrative capital stack of how adaptation is currently funded in developing countries. And what you'll find is that it's a lot of international public finance. We're going to talk about what that is, some domestic public finance. It's people spending on their own resilience, and then it's a little bit of private money, a little bit of insurance, a little bit of philanthropy capital or charitable giving. In developed countries, that stack looks very different, with the private sector and insurance playing a much bigger role and international public finance just not a thing, generally speaking. So that stack is going to look different. One of the things that we're dealing with is it's very hard to estimate how much money is currently going into adaptation. And so I'll speak a little bit about that in this slide, where we've compiled and developed estimates of adaptation finance flows globally. So this includes both developing and developed countries. We've lumped it all together. We've done a bottom-up analysis of how much money are the US and the European Union and China and India spending on adaptation. We've compiled estimates, in particular those developed by the Climate Policy Initiative, which does great analysis on this topic. And so this is the relative size of those buckets, right? Domestic spend, so governments spending money on their own country, or even local governments spending money locally, is the bulk of adaptation finance right now. It's a bigger bubble maybe than we expected. It's also a lot smaller than it should be because there's a lot of needs, and we'll come back to that in a second. International development aid, so that's money going to developing countries to help with adaptation, is a much smaller piece of that bucket. And domestic spend in developing countries, which are much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, is also a much smaller piece of that bucket. So that speaks to the relative size of public spend globally. And then the pink and purples are private capital flows. The biggest one is insurance, but insurance is primarily in developed countries. There is a lot of money being spent by households on their own resilience. We'll come back to that. And that that number is very hard to estimate as well. But it's clear, we're getting clear signal that there is quite a bit of money being spent there. And then what's really missing is the money coming from private sources like banks and private investors and corporations. And again, those are very rough estimates, but the relative size of those bubbles is the signal that's important here. And if you think about globally, money that moves around in the world, the private sector bubbles are much, much, much bigger than anything governments can and do finance in the economy, generally speaking. And so it's a massive gap. It's also a big opportunity to ramp up how much money is coming from the private sector to help finance some of those adaptation efforts. Now, it's not easy to finance adaptation, especially for the private sector, but also for the public sector for a range of reasons. The first one is that there's still some challenges around understanding when and how precisely climate impacts are going to manifest, how quickly they're going to worsen or increase in frequency and intensity, and both the perceived uncertainty and the real challenges around accessing locally relevant climate data can be a barrier to investing in adaptation or knowing how to invest in the right thing or to fund the right project. It's also challenging to specifically measure adaptation success. And one way to think about it is that because adaptation touches every sector of the economy and human development, you can leverage existing metrics around human development and health and agricultural yield and business interruptions. But unlike carbon dioxide emissions, where there is a clear, single, scientifically established, easy to measure um, single number, adaptation again reflects the complexity of human society and human life. And so it can make it harder for sources of capital that are specifically tied to impact metrics or to make sure that, again, money is going in the right direction. Adaptation activities don't always make money. And that's important because if you are trying to tap private sources of capital, you're going to need to be able to give money back as a cost of that capital, either in the form of an interest on a loan or return on investment for an investment. And so finding ways to monetize, to make money out of certain adaptation activity is important to be able to tap private sector and open up a much bigger pool of capital. It is a little bit of a trope to say mitigation can be financed easily. It's easy to make money off a windmill or solar panel, but adaptation cannot be financed by the private sector so easily, because what's happened historically is that a lot of mitigation type activities like renewable energy has been financed by public money until the technology became cheap enough and the business models were established enough that the private sector was able to come in at scale. We haven't had the benefit of this public investment and this deliberate effort to look for monetization of adaptation activities yet in adaptation. And so that's something to think about when we look ahead. And then the last point, which I'll expand on in my next slide, is that the people and the countries who need most money are the ones who have the least. There is a massive gap in between how much money is spent on adaptation in developing countries and the needs as modeled by the United Nations Environmental Program. And so there is an urgency to raise awareness, to get more money from governments globally, but again, also to find ways to attract private capital to adaptation projects so that there is just more money going around in the grand scheme of things. So in this next section, I'll just cover quickly each part of the capital stack, all the different sources of money that can come into adaptation, bring it all together, and then hand it over to Kathy to give an example of how they can be combined. And this is all the primer, which you can find online on our respective websites and spend more time. So when you look at international public adaptation finance, which is typically the first thing that comes to mind and one of the main sources of money, it's money coming from multilateral development banks or bilateral development finance institutions, Scratch USAID, PRUT BII, or Proparco, or AFD, or another name here, or specialized funds like the Green Environmental Facility, the Green Climate Fund, which are funded by developed countries globally. And then that money is either given as a grant or often it is loaned to governments and to large projects in developing countries that are going to help with adaptation. And I put a bunch of examples here at the bottom. When you look at governments, either national or local governments, domestic public adaptation finance, this is probably one of the main sources of adaptation finance, certainly that we could find in developed countries. It's also very hard to quantify. Nobody has a good number. Nobody is tracking that, neither at the national level nor globally trying to estimate those flows. What we know is that generally there should be more. And that can take a lot of different shapes. It could be a government paying to support under-resourced communities. It could be cities redoing their water infrastructure or building flood barriers. It could be local transportation agencies or states doing all kinds of measures. So all of these things are adaptation. And all of these are currently very often pain points in terms of how much money is available. Now we get into things that are maybe less commonly known. So we wanted to flag as one of the potential sources of capital, disaster risk finance. Disaster risk finance is when a government or development finance institution, national or local government, sets aside money ahead of time in the expectation that it is likely that a certain type of disaster will happen. And when it happens, they want to have that money available to pay for the post-disaster recovery. And so some examples in the US, FEMA is a kind of disaster risk finance. There's local governments that have this type of funds that they set aside. The World Bank runs a large disaster resilience fund that they make available to countries that need it. And it may seem obvious, but it's really important to have that money set aside ahead of time. And very often, those disasters are predictable. We know that there is a high probability of certain type of disaster happening in certain places. And so that's one thing to think about. And again, we put a number of examples here as examples of disaster risk finance. Another emerging concept, but that could open new sources of financing, is the concept of loss and damage. So we'll start by the chart at the bottom to establish what are loss and damage. Loss and damage describes the adverse effects of climate change that cannot be avoided by mitigation or minimized with adaptation. And so it is used as a shorthand to refer to money that can be paid to compensate, to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage. It's a new concept. It is a little bit of a controversial concept because it comes with the concept of responsibility, liability, culpability that a number of countries or corporates are pushing back against. But it's also a growing source of funding with a new fund hosted by the World Bank that has over 600 million committed to date, which is several order of magnitude smaller than the needs, where it is estimated that developing countries may confront as much as $580 billion in climate-related damages. So again, these are the things that we can't save, and therefore one needs to be compensated for those losses. We're going to switch gear now and talk a little bit about private sector money. So private sector money usually has a cost, right? So it's financing, it's either an investment or a loan, generally speaking. So here we're talking about banks and credit institutions. They're going to lend money, they're going to expect capital and interest back. And that can take many shapes or forms. And again, as if you remember the earlier chart with the bubbles, the banks were tiny, whereas banks in the real economy are absolutely critical and providing a lot of funding, a lot of financing for a lot of activities. So what we're saying here is that banks could be lending money to households to help change their roof, fortify their roof, to help to small businesses, to help get a backup generator, get better cooling system for small ag and food businesses, to get new irrigation systems for smallholder farmers. That there's a lot of adaptation-related financing that could happen that is largely not happening yet. And it's a matter of helping bring together the understanding that funding those activities, financing those activities is going to help protect the credit worthiness of the borrower. It's going to mean the borrower is better able to repay the loan down the road if they have access to this money to make these investments in adaptation and resilience. It's also for banks an opportunity to sell new products and make money. And so that is a good thing because that's an incentive for them to bring capital and to develop loan products and lending products that can be used for adaptation activities. Investments is also one where there is an expectation of something coming back. In this instance, what comes back is the return on investment. So you put money and then you get more money back. And how much money you expect to get back depends on how risky the initial investment is. And the investment world is very, very broad. There's very different types of activities ranging from investing in large corporations, public equity, so buying shares of publicly traded companies, all the way down to the kind of things that we do of investing in a very small, very early stage startup that's very risky, but may grow into a bigger company. And there's vast pools of capital that are available out there. There's usually a lot of constraint over how the money can be used, what kind of expectation people have. And so it can be hard to use that money for adaptation, but it really also can be done. And it's a matter of identifying the opportunities and matching the appetite from the investors in terms of returns and risks with the profile of the project or the company that is looking for investments. And so again, you'll find a lot of examples in the deck that presents very different examples of investments. I also want to talk about corporations as a source of capital. And here I'm talking about large corporations, again, the ones you read about in the newspapers right now, because they're very big buyers of stuff, of products and services. And they're important because they have global supply chain, they have global operations, they have money, and they have a responsibility to manage their assets, to minimize risk. They need their facilities to be open. They need that road that brings to the facility to be open. They need their employees to be able to come to work. They need their suppliers to be able to ship their goods. And so they have a direct vested interest in investing in the resilience, not just of their own stuff and facilities and people, but also in that of the communities where they operate and the infrastructure that they depend on. And so that's another example where the current spend is much smaller than it needs to be and than it should be. But there is a really good economic argument for that spend to become much larger. And so we're hoping that through education, through clear opportunity, we can find opportunities to expand how much money is coming from corporations and financing projects that help with adaptation and resilience globally. And again, lots of examples across different sectors, across different type of activities of things that are currently happening that some corporations are doing. We just need many more of them to do it and to do it at scale. I mentioned earlier households. So by households, we mean both people and their home, but also smallholder farmers, small businesses that in many ways are more like a family than a big corporation because of the size of their budget, because of how decisions are made, because of the scope of their work. And so not a lot of money, not a lot of financial reserves. They're the kind of businesses that if they're hit by a disaster, they might never reopen. And so there's a lot of short and long-term benefits in reinforcing resilience for those groups to save lives, to protect the economy. And what we wanted to highlight here is that there's a lot of money moving around right now because households and small business owners and smallholder farmers are not waiting for permission or for standards or for anything. They are spending the money to protect their lives and livelihoods right now. And so that's both an opportunity because if money is being spent, let's make sure it's spent as efficiently as possible. It's a little bit of a concern from my perspective because it raises major equity issues. Some can spend the money and will do it, but many cannot and don't have that money. But also that money may not be spent as efficiently through individual purchasing decisions than it would if it was a coordinated effort. And so there is really a responsibility from local governments and community partners to help make sure that those individual decisions are made using best available science, best practices. And then there is a responsibility to governments and corporations to not free ride and let people that can barely afford it pay for those things when, again, it could be and should be a more social and societal investments. Again, lots of examples, lots of different types of financing flows going around. And we'll come back to that important element in a minute when Kathy talks about one of the case studies that's focused on supporting households and individuals who have impacts who are affected by the impacts of climate change. Insurance is a big deal. It's a major risk transfer mechanism. Insurance is itself increasingly affected by climate impact. So that means that it's becoming harder and harder for insurance companies to actually provide insurance in certain geographies, like California, where I'm from, because there's just so many disasters and they're so expensive that they're just going to go out of business if they keep providing insurance at the current price. So it's a really important mechanism. It is itself threatened by climate, and there is a broader conversation in society about that right now. It's also grossly underused in a lot of developing countries where there is a very large protection gap. And by that, we mean there's just a lot of people who don't have insurance at all. And insurance has been proven to be a key mechanism for people to get back on their feet and for communities to be able to recover and rebuild after major events. There's very different types of different insurance policies, different types of insurance. We won't get into that. We have a little more in the primer itself, and there's a lot that's been written about that. But thinking creatively about using insurance and generally risk transfer mechanisms is one of the cutting edge part of adaptation finance. And again, we'll see a great example with Kathy's case study in a few minutes. Last but not least, philanthropic capital. Philanthropic capital is a very small piece of global financial flow. And I say that not to minimize their contribution, but to remind listeners that it's really tiny. A lot of people pushing for the same, looking for the same buckets of money when they just can't fund everything, right? It's also a really important part of the capital stack because it's money that does not expect a return. It's money that's being given away or that can be loaned or invested with a much higher risk tolerance or much better terms than one would get on the private sector. And to Jess's point earlier, philanthropic capital can play a key role in being catalytic and so in bringing other types of capital because they take that risk away or because they bring in better terms. And so that's a very important role that philanthropic capital can play. Those different pools of capitals can be combined. It's usually referred to as blended finance. And it's a much longer conversation, but it's important to think that you don't have to look for one or the other. You can think about ways to combine the sources of money, and that's going to give you access to a broader pool of capital. And I'll end on this slide, and we can come back to it later in the Q&A, which is our vision for the role that each of those buckets should play in adaptation finance. And we're not going to get into the details here, but the key message here is we need every color of capital. We need the whole capital stack to really play its role in financing adaptation. And right now, that's not the case. And so this is a call to for all of you who are listening to this and many others to think about ways to bring different sources of capital to adaptation. With that, I'll turn it over to Kathy, who will present one of our case studies. We have 3 in the primer. We won't cover all of them today, but they're worth looking at.
Thank you, Emily. Fantastic. Adaptation finance in 33 minutes. It's very impressive. And I also see some questions coming in. That's great. We'll turn to them quickly as soon as we are done with the case study. This case study to flow right out of that capital stack is a combination of household and small business spend, risk capital, and philanthropy. And so the tenets of this are that extreme heat disproportionately hurts women, especially women in the informal sector, exposed to heat outside and in uncooled spaces, temperatures reaching as high as 50 and beyond. Last heat season in May in South Asia. This project is a partnership with the Self-Employed Women's Association and Swiss Re and a local insurer, ICICI Lombard. We're just getting underway on the second year of this program. Last year, 50,000 participants across 8 trades, all heat exposed, construction workers, waste recyclers, farmers, home-based workers, street vendors, you get the idea. The heat is so intense that it is harming their health, such that 6 members of the Self-Employed Women's Association lost their lives to heat last year during in late May. And so this is to put a very fine point on how urgent this is, and yet the need for income is everything. And so the idea is that when it's too hot to work, that an insurance, in addition to a lower level triggered social protection of cash, is the way that we can help support the income through extreme heat. And so members across 23 districts in 3 states in India paid a third of the premium, and philanthropy from Climate Resilience for All and our funders, including Climate Works Foundation, paid for the rest of that. And then the risk capital is being provided by ICICI Lombard and Swiss Re. And so those 3 sources combined to create a program that has a cash layer that triggers at a lower temperature threshold. And this type of insurance is called a parametric insurance. And what it means is that when a certain numerical threshold is met, money is then wired to, in this case, the bank account of 50,000 women. And in this case, 50,000 women were benefited from a cash support of 2 days of income, which is approximately $3 a day. And then 92% of the participants had an insurance payout ranging between $7.50 and $19.80, something like that, depending on how many days their conditions met, that trigger was met. And so we have to highlight how important the grassroots leaders are from the Self-Employed Women's Association, their organization and connectivity to their members. But then I also want to point out how important it is that risk is also reduced, not just transferred. And so you think of risk transfer as the insurance. We want to, as the risk continue to rise, we need to keep lowering the risk, reducing the risk. And so we have learned very clearly that insurance has to be combined with risk reduction, and that can come in forms of early warning systems, physical risk reduction of umbrellas, shade, solar lights to work at night, tarps, things like that. And then when we look at how where we're going with this, we'll have significantly more participants this year, and we're walking toward, as you participate in this program, you're also raising your heat literacy, but you're raising your insurance and risk literacy, so you understand what you're buying and why. And so over time, we have a 5-year plan for the insurance to be fully supported by the member, with philanthropy and things like loss and damage, supporting the social layer protection and the risk reduction practices. And then as another potential small business, the cooling stations that provide multiple services for the women are a part of that risk reduction, but also a small business for women, providing access to other women to use the bathroom, access to cooling for their lunch, a place to rest when they don't have one otherwise. And so this example is being replicated and combined with other things just in the last couple of years. And CRA is taking the Women's Climate Shock Insurance and Livelihoods Initiative, which is what we call it, the WCSI, to Thailand, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and we also work in Pakistan. So just to give you a flavor of the plans for scaling. So let me close there. We are, we're doing great. Okay, so let us go to the questions. Kartikeya had a question about, and I'll turn this to you, Emily, about incremental adaptation versus transformational adaptation. And I have an answer, but I'd like to hear your answer as it relates to finance.
I think I'd rather you take that one.
Okay, all right, I will. So I think it is related to finance, and it's also related to an understanding of how money flows. And so if you don't have the relationships and the understanding at the local level of what the needs are, and then what is going to work best in terms of the risk reduction and the adaptation, you end up with incremental, and incremental may not be bad because adaptation is so local. So there's the ability to replicate, but you also have to, it has to be locally driven and relevant, or it's not successful. And so transformational would be the data necessary for early warning systems that could be based on health outcomes. And so you'd have mortality, morbidity data, you'd have a weather station that's not 50 kilometers from the person you're insuring. That's one of our challenges, so, where the data comes from. So those are some big transformational adaptation potentials, but they're not, incremental is also still building the evidence base and showing people how to do it. And Emily, I think you made this point, but I want to just put a line underneath it of how much time and money and policy and incentives went into mitigation and energy finance in the transition to help to get to a point where we are now, where it's standard. And so adaptation needs that same attention to the field. So anyway, Kartikeya, happy to talk more about that later. Okay,
I'll take
Ritika.
the next one.
Adaptation financing, large corporations. Curious about your thoughts on the viability of collective action approaches. Could we imagine clothing companies jointly providing parametric insurance for smallholder? Yes. I mean, this is, you can taste it. Yes, we can do this. We can do this. We need, we've got the evidence is forming. We need more analysis in terms of projecting economically. If we know, and this is our specific focus is extreme heat. If we know that extreme heat is draining worker productivity, let's project economically the interventions that reduce the worker productivity losses. And so let's say, what would a company make more if their workers were cooled at night? Let's find out, and let's create those mechanisms. The answer is absolutely yes.
Yeah, and I'll pile on that one a
Please.
little bit, because there's another really important point in that, which is adaptation is a team sport. It's like if people stay in their lane, we're not going to make it. It's water polo. We need to pass the ball, and there needs to be collaboration between the public and the private sector, between community groups, and that's hard. And as my friend Shalini says, who also works on adaptation in at the local level in the US, like if you're not in a coalition with people that you're not comfortable with, you're in the wrong room. Like you need to be talking. It means local governments talking to their businesses, big and small, and finding ways to bring some of that capital. And there are examples of that happening in different places, but it's not the main way things operate. And there are cultural and institutional challenges in making that happen. And so that's why I pulled up the capital stack slide again to capital stack, sorry, slide again to illustrate that point, is that we need to be able to pull in from those different sources of capital, and there should be pre-competitive spaces where companies can work together and finance the things that help them. And so there's examples of AT&T working with the federal government to make climate models available to local communities because AT&T needed the road to access their telecom tower, and it's not under their control. And so they made that data available and worked with local communities because then it helped with everyone's resilience. There's examples of local government and corporations working together to invest in flood mitigation in a way that protects everyone's assets. And that needs to become the norm. And right now it's the exception. And one of the challenges is that it needs people, organizations, group who do this bringing together and smoothing out differences in how people think and get together. And that's the sort of an extra layer of cost, even if it's not huge, that can be a big enabler, but it's also something that needs to be funded one way or another.
And Emily, there's a collection of questions here that I think are best suited for you to take the first crack. Asking about crowdfunding adaptation projects. I think the answer is yes, but let's just keep going to collect to be efficient. Case studies are there that demonstrate catalytic capital in systematically attracting non-concessionary market rate capital. I mean, this is the market rate. Yeah,
I
let's
don't
talk.
know if the Catalyst Fund is online. I know they were registered to join, but that's a great example. There's a number of other funds that, and there's not a million, but funds that do that, that bring together philanthropic capital and private capital, and then invest it in startups that have resilience impacts on the community. So there are absolutely ways to do that. And the crowdfunding piece, I know of at least one startup, and I'll put a plug for them, Thermoshade, that is crowdfunding for their project because they still need to prove the technology, and that's how they're trying to access capital.
Great. This one from James Newland says, which financial instruments or capital stacks have been successful in creating incentives for more private sector investment in initiatives which generate wide social benefits? That's a great question. Which private institution's been most willing to commit funding? The list is shrinking.
It's shrinking in people who are raising their hands. I'm
Yes.
hoping that
Yeah. Visibly so. Visibly so. Yes. Yeah.
I'll just point here to the playbook in particular that we published a few months ago. That's a longer piece that's focused on private sector and specifically on how to finance innovation. But it has a lot of case studies and examples from corporations in the private, large corporations, small companies, private funds, who's investing, what money are they putting? And there are groups that tend to attract those corporations. So industry organizations like C2ES in the US, the World Business Sustainable Council globally, the Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change in Europe, the Australian Asian equivalent. Those are groups that bring together investors, corporations who are thinking actively about those issues. They're exchanging best practices. They're publishing guidance for the rest of the sectors. And so if you look at the membership of those organizations, you're going to find the people who are being really proactive in thinking about those issues.
So Delaney's asking, and hey, Delaney, thanks for joining. Wondering that, yes, we've had a lot of disclosure focus, but we're not valuing the need to invest now in order to actually shape growth trajectories or avoid deeper shocks down the line. What role could rating agencies or other gatekeepers play in shifting us from transparency toward actual deployment at scale? I mean, amen, sister. Go, Emily.
They can and they should and they are thinking about it, but it goes back to those barriers that I was mentioning earlier. If you don't know exactly, if you can't predict what event will happen and how much it would cost, it's harder to quantify the benefit of investing in adaptation. And that's the whole story, is like if you can't show how much loss you're avoiding, or even if you're showing you're avoiding a loss, but you're not making money with a project, it's hard to finance. And so those are the kind of things that people are thinking about, but that there isn't an easy answer to.
Yeah. Looks like the last question, and this is just coming in perfectly. What do you see as the biggest barriers to this kind of collective corporate adaptation investment? Is it about de-risking the initial capital to prove the model, as you did with parametric insurance for outdoor workers? Is it governance, like who leads the charge, or is it about making the opportunity cost of inaction more tangible, or something else entirely? Just in terms of the parametric, the NDMA of India has multiple sophisticated insurance schemes and programs in their social protection set of interventions. And so in lots of places, the government is a big part of the answer. The other, back to the economic, the data that we need to see what kind of costs, not just savings, but other cash flows that come from it. But let me, Emily, turn it to you to answer this question also.
Yeah, great question. I think I don't know which one is the biggest barriers, but I think all of these are barriers. And if we can start nudging, starting to take them down a little bit, it will help, right? So there is an element of education and awareness, and that's very much what we're trying to tackle here, is to try to narrow the gap a little bit between different groups and broaden the aperture in terms of thinking about what is adaptation finance, so that people can find common grounds and work together. I do think that the continuous work on understanding climate impacts and the cost is valuable. I will also say there's a ton of information out there. We know a lot about what's going to happen and how much it's going to cost. So it's also a little bit of an excuse analysis paralysis. There are a lot of no regret things that could and should be done that are not being done. So I will say be careful with the data. In some cases, it's really truly a major gap or barrier. In other times, it's like the data exists and people are just not
Risk
taking it.
intolerant. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want to quickly put a plug. There's a question about blended finance, and I want to put a plug for Convergence, which is one of the main group that thinks about those issues in terms of blended capital, and also, and I'll write those names in the Q&A. Prime Coalition in the US they don't necessarily call it blended finance, but they do this work in terms of investing in early stage innovation in climate, and there's a lot of lessons learned, even if most of the projects that are examples are in the mitigation or maybe even other sectors, they can be learning opportunities for adaptation. So we can copy things that work elsewhere. We don't need to invent new things necessarily.
Great. I'm just looking at Anna's comment. Thank you, Anna. Go Canada. Claire, she is asking, is there not a strong case for corporates to ensure their supply chains in the way we describe? Yes, there is a strong case. And I think in some cases it's happening. Some of this is just not visible in public. So I think lots are. And as Emily said, more and more tools to understand what the assets at risk, like what the cost of not doing that is. But Emily, did you want to comment on that one from Claire?
Sorry, I don't see the.
Oh, is there not a strong case for corporates to ensure their supply chains in the way that we described?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are examples, and we wrote a report about this 10 years ago with the Global Compact in my previous role at 427 called the business case for responsible corporate adaptation. And it can be found, just email me if you can find it. But we had like 20 case studies of corporations investing in adaptation. And a lot of those were in their supply chain. An example of ag and food companies investing in their deep supply chain, because if you're if you're on cold ends and you don't have rice, then right, there's just the people need those communities and those suppliers to be able to function and operate. So there are a lot of great examples. I will say, just not to be completely tone deaf to what's happening right now, the uncertainty around global trade is going to make those kind of activities a little harder for a little while, because are companies going to change their supply chains? How does that affect their ability to really invest in long-term relationship and support for their suppliers, which has been a lot of the corporates' efforts over the past 10, 15 years. I think, unfortunately, that's another collateral damage from what's happening right now, is the ability to really invest in relationship and long-term economic and social resilience of suppliers.
So we are out of time, and we are so appreciative that you spent the hour with us, and thank you for the good questions and comments. This deck is available both on the climateresilience.org and the Tailwind website.
And I will post the report on my LinkedIn profile as someone asked. That's a great way to get it out.
Please do. Yeah, let's keep the conversation going and lean in to this, and everybody needs it. And so it is positive, and being creative is the way to go. And Emily, thank you very much. And thanks again to ClimateWorks Foundation for their support, and to Jess. And you all have a great afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. And thanks for attending.
Thank you.
Next time.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Kathy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.